Let's see the usage of services. We have discussed multiple services. Now, I told you that there are three types of services. You have also seen how services work, which is nothing but an entry in the IP table. We have type node port, cluster IP, and load balancer. Now, how does service fit in the entire application architecture? So I'll use a three-tier architecture, which you must be familiar with. You have front end, back end, and database server. You should not host databases in Kubernetes. That's an anti-pattern. I don't want to suggest that you use Kubernetes for hosting your databases. Definitely not. Okay, so let's see 3D architecture. So these are the three deployments that we have. These are not clusters. These are deployments and can be spread across multiple nodes in the Kubernetes cluster. Each gray box is a deployment and the blue boxes are the pods. Now, this one is front end. So this deployment is for the front end application. This is for backend 1 application and this is for backend 2 application. So, but obvious, as we have front end, we would like any external communication happening to our front end services or front end application. External meaning internet. So in that case, we'll create a service of type node port because it gives you can use the public IP address of the node itself to access the application. And it can be any one of the nodes because of course the deployment would be spread across multiple nodes. So external applications connect to the service and the service sends the traffic to the front end application deployed by the deployment using a load balanced fashion. Now the host name and the DNS thing, hold that for some time. We'll discuss DNS maybe later on. But yes, that is how node port service would be used. Now what about services in between these two application stack? For backend 1 and backend 2, it would be creating cluster IP service, and the front end would use this cluster IP service to connect to the backend 1 application or the backend 1 component, and backend 1 would use another cluster IP service to communicate to backend 2. So this is how cluster IP and node port would be used. The perfect use case for these two types of services. What about load balancer? We have not discussed services of type load balancer yet. Now the reason I have not discussed load balancer is because the implementation of load balancer service type is done by cloud service providers. So we will defer this talk until EKS or GKE. There is one more usage of services, and that is to access external application. Now, what do I mean by external application here? Now, let's say we have a Kubernetes cluster and you have hosted an application here or application component, whatever you might want to call it. What would be external to this? So, any other Kubernetes cluster would be external to Kubernetes cluster 1. So, you can have an application in another Kubernetes cluster also, and let's say if this application wants to talk to this application, wants to communicate, we'll have to create a service, and that service will be used to communicate between applications across multiple clusters. Now, not only that, there's one more interesting use case. Let's say you have a database which can be hosted on-prem, which can be hosted on cloud, but definitely outside of any Kubernetes cluster whatsoever. The database implementation can be using any PaaS services provided by the cloud service providers or a database server on a server itself. Does not matter. So you can use a service to access such external applications also. Meaning an application or database which is not in Kubernetes. So external application services does not constrain you only to be within the ecosystem of Kubernetes. You can access applications outside of it as well. Now the question might arise, how would you do so? Why would you like to do it? Okay, from from one Kubernetes cluster to another Kubernetes cluster still makes sense because otherwise how would you access an application? What about application outside of Kubernetes cluster itself? Now the point here is that this application might change anytime. So it can be a database, it can be any other application, it might change. And what you want to do is you want to safeguard your application which is in Kubernetes from any changes that happen here. So this application will talk to this service, and this service will actually connect to this external application. So any changes would not impact this application, because think of it this way. Let's say this there is a database which you have created on-prem, and for some reason the IP address of that database changes, and if you put that directly in the application, you have to go ahead and redeploy the application from scratch. So another way to avoid that is creating a service which will be used to connect to this external application. Now, the way we create services for external application is a little different. We have to create a service without a port selector, something like this. The API version would be v1, kind would again be service, metadata and spec would be there, and in the ports you mention the target port and the protocol. So target port is the port on which you're trying to connect to, and port is the service port, and the protocol has to be mentioned as well. Now it will not be suffice, we'll have to create one more object called endpoint that will be used to make a connection between your service and the external application. So here let's say we have a service and we want to use that service to connect to a MySQL database, and the database is hosted on a server of IP address 1070.22.10, and the database is running on port 3306. So I'll be creating an endpoint object wherein in the subset it will mention the address to be the IP address of the database and port to be the port of the database, and this port is actually has been mentioned in the target port of the ports. So let us see a demo. This is what we'll do in this demo. We'll create a MySQL database server. I'll use a Cloud SQL service provided by GCP. You can use RDS also. So any one of them is fine. Or you can use your own server, your own machine, or an EC2 instance or a compute engine instance from GCP. Does not matter. So what I want is the endpoint. So we'll create this MySQL database, and then let's say I'll have a deployment which will have 4 pods running. Now I want to connect from an application inside of this pod to this MySQL database. So how to do that? We'll create a service and we'll use this service to do the communication from the application in the deployment to the MySQL database. Notice that MySQL database is completely external to the deployment which has been deployed or which will be deployed in the Kubernetes cluster that we have. But MySQL is outside of it. It is kind of alien to the Kubernetes cluster.